Oppression, brutality, and anarchy. How did Iraq become like this? Well, let's try and find out. That's what we're gonna do. Hello and welcome to Feature History featuring Saddam's Iraq. You see it on the news every week. Civil War in Iraq. What is it about? Why did it happen? And who's to blame? I'm going to attempt to take a step back from any kind of finger pointing here and just get into the plain old facts of how Iraq became like it is today. That means no Bush did it, goddamn Jews, or any kind of larger conspiracy. Plus, I imagine the comments will take care of those for me. I'm sure just about anyone old enough to process the words I'm saying remembers Saddam Hussein, the presidential dictator of Iraq. But who is he really? What did he actually do? And why was he public enemy number one? These are the questions I'm going to attempt to answer. So strap in, buddy, it's gonna be a long one. I've gotten ahead of myself somewhat here, so let's take a step back. In fact, let's take a leap back all the way to 1918. The Ottoman Empire is defeated in the First World War, and the British and French get to work doing what they do best: empire. Ottoman territory is partitioned vaguely into what we have today, and the state of Iraq is born under British control. The British took it upon itself to select Sunni Arabs for the position of power in government and ministry, despite the majority of the population being Shiites. They also decided the government would be a monarchy with Faisal I of Iraq at its head. It wasn't until 1932 that the Kingdom of Iraq became an independent state at the request of Faisal. The people of Iraq, though, were not pleased with serving under the Syrian Hashemite dynasty, and several high-ranking officers known as the Golden Square staged a coup in 1941. The British were able to beat back the disgruntled officers in the Anglo-Iraqi War and keep the king and his dynasty in power. Despite this initial coup being a failure, it set a trend, and it became clear to onlookers that Iraq was not a stable country in these turbulent times. In fact, Iraq would face much government instability in the Arab Cold War to follow, which would span from 1952 to 1970. Saddam Hussein Abd al-Mahid al-Tikriti was born in 1937 to a poor family near the town of Tikrit. He fell in line with the popular anti-British Arab nationalist sentiments and dropped out of secondary school to join the Ba'ath Party in Baghdad. The Ba'ath Party preached ideas of Arab unity and dismantling foreign imperialism within the region. When Saddam joined the party, they had been conspiring to assassinate the Iraqi Prime Minister Abdel Karim Qazim, who had overthrown the monarchy in the 1958 July Revolution. Not to be confused with the 1830 July Revolution of the same name. Plan successfully failed horribly, and Saddam fled to Egypt in the most classic of ways, on a donkey in the desert. He didn't return home until the 1963 coup that saw members of the Ba'ath Party and Abdul Salam Arif take power. Tensions grew between President Arif and the Ba'athist leader of choice Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, for who truly held more power. Despite the unease within the new Iraqi government, discussions began between Syria, which had recently seen its own Ba'athist revolution, and Egypt for unification. Al-Bakr decided at the same time he would not allow himself to be second fiddle to Arif, and the Ba'athist members of the government threw Arif and all other non-Ba'athist members out of the cabinet to secure a fully Ba'athist regime. Saddam began his own push for power within the government, attempting to work his way up the chain of power, but negotiations of unity broke down and the Ba'athist Party in Syria and Iraq were split. Arif saw weakness in the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and led a counter-coup against them, putting Saddam's plans to a halt, and he, like many other Ba'athists, were imprisoned. Arif continued to reign as president until a plane crash saw his demise. When his brother succeeded him, the Ba'athists were able to trigger a bloodless coup and place al-Bakr as president in 1968. Releasing Saddam from prison in the process. Saddam, being a distant relative of al-Bakr, soon became his vice president and took it upon himself to purify the government, clearing all those dissidents through either imprisonment, torture, or execution. A decade later, in 1979, Saddam was able to apply pressure and persuade al-Bakr to retire, having Saddam sworn in as the new leader of the republic. To ensure a secure transition, Saddam ordered the execution of dozens of top-ranking officers. Saddam had done it. After decades of work, he had secured the position as the 5th president of Iraq at 42 years of age. He wished to flex his newfound power and show the world the superiority of the Iraqi Arabs. He needed an enemy, someone to rile the people up against, and so he chose Iran for several reasons. First off was they were seemingly an easy target, recently coming out of a revolution that left the Ayatollah Khomeini leading a Shiite theocracy. They were unorganized, unproven, and had made a shit ton of enemies. They also had no friendly feelings toward Iraq either, as Khomeini proclaimed they would expand their theocratic ways across the evil secular nations that surrounded them. A nation like, just for the sake of example, Iraq. Of course, not everything was based on ideology. There's always a goal, if not multiple. The goals were to annex the region of Khuzestan, a predominantly Arab region under Persian rule, secure the Shatt al-Arab waterway which connected the economically vital Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and secure a nice big Gulf shoreline with some good oil fields. On the 22nd of September 1980, Saddam declared war in a surprise attack. He decided, as a man with no military education and not even a secondary school pass, he would be the best fit for the supreme commander of the military strategy. His plan was so exceedingly cunning. He would order a third of his army to move across the northern border, securing the defense of Baghdad in case of any counterattack. He ordered another third of his army to move through the center, cutting off North and South Iran. And yet another third would move across the south, securing their objectives in Khuzestan. Or, to simplify his strategy, he lined his entire army up on the border and told them to march forward. In Saddam's defense, he did expect the Iranians to almost immediately splinter, but then to criticize Saddam, he was completely wrong. His invasion served to cement Khomeini's rule, as he was able to rally his people behind the common enemy, a bit like almost exactly what Saddam was doing. Saddam also severely overestimated his own army's ability. He assigned them too many objectives at once and planned his strategy without even considering an Iranian defense. The Iraqis would quickly find themselves overstretched and overencumbered and attempted retreat. Saddam wasn't very fond of this and executed any general who dared to do so. After executing about 3 of them, he ordered a retreat. Within 2 years, the Iraqi army had been forced onto the strategic defense, and Saddam considered a unilateral ceasefire. Khomeini refused, overestimating his own forces just like Saddam had. He demanded that Saddam be removed from power and Iran receive compensation. Take a wild guess at how Saddam felt about that option. Iran launched Operation Ramadan. Objectives were to capture Basra, Iraq's only port, and sprinkle a bit of destroyed infrastructure everywhere they went. With the war lasting as long as it did, Iraq still needed to make money, and so would run its oil trading through third-party countries such as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Iran decided that it didn't care too much about little old things like internationally witnessed war crimes, and continued on attacking Iraq's oil shipments, causing many of the world's powers to back Iraq against this menace. Iran, with only numbers and radical fervor to their name, launched attack after attack towards the Iraqis' entrenched positions, only to be slaughtered in chemical weapons attack and artillery barrages, heavily reminiscent of the Great War. By 1988, Iran had exhausted itself with persistent failure over the years. It lacked the resources to continue sending their men to the slaughter, only to be thanked with Scud missile attacks on Tehran. By April 1988, after having been gifted a substantial amount of resources and now prioritizing the benefits of mechanized warfare, Iraq was able to launch a large-scale counterattack into Iran. This would be the final breaking point. Khomeini accepted UN Resolution 598, calling for an immediate ceasefire on July 20th, 1988. Official peace would come later on the 20th of August, and most would consider the result as a stalemate. Iraq and Iran, though? Well, both believed they were the respective victors. Over 1 million had died and Middle Eastern affairs had been permanently scarred, but no side made any true gains. After the Iran-Iraq War, the country was devastated and heavily in debt. The oil infrastructure and economy needed rebuilding and rejuvenation. Kuwait made this almost impossible, constantly demanding that Iraq pay back their debts, while Kuwait itself drove them out of the market by constantly dropping oil prices and exceeding their quotas. On top of this, Kuwait had also struck a nerve in Saddam by not respecting Iraqi borders and drilling into the Rumelia oil field on the border. George Herbert Walker Bush, or for the sake of time, Bush Sr., intervened in the quarrel and judged that Kuwait should pay $10 billion. Yes, that's billion with a B, to Iraq in compensation. The Emir of Kuwait, Jaber III, only actually paid back 9 of the 10 billion, and Saddam was outraged. Now this might sound like a bit of an overreaction over just missing out of 1 of the 10 billion, but you have to keep in mind that he's being swindled out of $1 billion. I can't justify his followed response though, which was to declare war and invade Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. He cited historical claims to the land, and within only 2 days had conquered the country. Jaber only narrowly escaped his palace and fled to Saudi Arabia, followed by hundreds of refugees. Kuwait was incapable of reconciling their forces and fighting back without foreign intervention, and so Jaber made sure the people's pleas were heard before the International Committee. The UN was quick to denounce Saddam and place sanctions on his country, but he was not deterred and announced that Kuwait was now the official 19th province of Iraq. Saddam also began to deploy troops to Iraq's borders with Saudi Arabia, which raised concerns for the close US ally. The US and other NATO nations began a military build-up in Saudi Arabia in an operation that was dubbed Operation Desert Shield. You'll notice they become big fans of the Operation Desert naming convention. It became clear to Saddam that a counterattack was inevitable, and he declared jihad against the West and its allies. Few actually answered the secular leader's call. He noted that Bush also began to use his time to rally a coalition of countries to fight against him. The coalition contained nations such as the UK, France, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and many, many more. Saddam attempted to garner his own allegiances, but only was able to acquire the pledge of a few other third world dictators. only Saddam of which would answer his war cry when the time came. Saddam, either arrogant or testing his luck, sent a list of demands to President Bush which called for an Israeli exodus from Palestinian lands, Iraqi access to the Persian Gulf, and even a beneficial trade deal with the US. Bush, after a long pause for thought, or to have a good laugh about such ridiculous demands, swiftly denied it. On November 29, 1990, the UN Security Council authorized the use of all necessary means of force against Iraq if Saddam refused to withdraw from Kuwait by the following 15th of January. That would almost sound ominous if it wasn't so bloody wordy. At the crack of dawn on January 17, 1991, a massive US-led air offensive hit Iraq's defenses. This bombing campaign, dubbed Operation Desert Storm, continued until mid-February. It was able to severely cripple Iraq's defenses, destroying much of its armor, artillery, and air force. Desert Storm would be followed by Operation Desert Saber, which was to bring the war to a close with the coalition's mass ground offensives that secured Kuwait and pushed the Iraqi forces back to Iraq. As the Iraqis retreated though, they employed a scorched earth strategy, destroying every oil well in their path. As US forces began to push into Iraq, Bush decided a ceasefire must be signed, which it was on the 20th of February, ending the Gulf War. Bush knew that occupying Iraq and removing Saddam's regime would pose serious threat to the stability of the region and would serve only to dissolve the state of Iraq into a region of warlords. I like to call this foreshadowing. Saddam agreed to the terms that in which would recognize Kuwait's sovereignty and Emir Jaber III's claim to that land. He would establish a no-fly zone in the northern region of Iraq, and he would strip the country of weapons of mass destruction, including any nuclear, biological, or chemical arms. After peace was made, the US attempted to encourage the Kurds and Shiites of Iraq to rise up and initiate an internal regime change, but they were swiftly stomped out by Saddam when the US failed to support them sufficiently. This indicated to the US that while Saddam's regional powers had been curbed, his internal reign of terror would continue with no end in sight. Iraq had been deeply scarred by its past two conflicts. Unrest ran amok, and the economic sanctions forced the people into either crime or starvation. Saddam was able to suppress two coups in both 1992 and 1993 and would make sure that those that dissent would pay in blood. The UN continued to harass Saddam, attempting to apply pressure for him to comply with the terms of the resolution that would see him destroy his stockpiles of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Saddam would constantly refuse and fly in the face of the Security Council again and again. He would, though, allow himself just enough of a margin of freedom in his responses so that he could renegotiate if threatened with force. On September 11, 2001, the World Trade Center attack shocked the world. Saddam, though, seeing a psychological blow dealt to his enemies, publicly applauded the attacks. The new president, good old George W., or Bush Jr. for our sake, whilst not linking Saddam to the attacks directly, did feel that he was a threat in this new age of global terror. He would famously place Iraq alongside Iran and North Korea when speaking of a new axis of evil, and so the world was set for the Iraq War II, Electric Boogaloo. In November 2002, the UN passed Resolution 1441, which would charge Iraq of violating Security Council resolutions and warned that they would face serious consequences as a result of its continued violations of its obligations. Bush Jr. knew that Saddam would have to be forced out of power, and Bush wouldn't take the same caution his father had offered, whether that be for good or for ill. Bush crafted a new coalition which featured the US, UK, Australia, and Poland to undertake the so subtly named Operation Iraqi Freedom. The mission was set up to strip Saddam of his power and his alleged weapons of mass destruction. You might want to ask how they knew if they even had them. Well, sometimes you can just feel it in your gut, you know what I'm saying? You feel me? Bush would offer Saddam a chance for himself and his family to leave Iraq and avoid invasion, but Saddam has never stepped down from a war in the past, so why would he start now? Saddam proclaimed to his people, "It is without doubt that the faithful will be victorious against aggression," and then made sure he would be the hell out of harm's way when the aggressors came and defeated the faithful. 90 minutes after the deadline had passed, the coalition set in act their campaign of shock and awe, which it certainly would shock and awe the angry people back home. The coalition troops that had been stationed in Kuwait also began their push into Iraq, constantly cautious of chemical attacks and guerrilla warfare tactics. It took 3 weeks until the coalition forces were able to defeat the Iraqi army and secure Baghdad and all surrounding major cities. Back at home, President Bush made the announcement to the many critics and protesters of this unabashed invasion that all major combat operations had ceased on May 1st, 2003. Mission accomplished. Right? War, like all things, except maybe like playing Reaper and Overwatch, is complicated. With the defeat of the conventional military forces of Iraq, dozens if not hundreds of insurgencies suddenly sprung up to happily fill the vacuum of power. The US attempted to soldier on, placing in power the long-oppressed Shiites, who then went on to suppress the Sunnis right back. The only applicable reaction at this point would have been, oh dear. Saddam was discovered in his hometown of Tikrit on the 13th of December 2003. He faced trial under the new government over the next few years and was found guilty on accusations of crimes against humanity. His fate, just like that of a medieval criminal, was to be hanged. Saddam Hussein died on the 30th of December 2006. But Arthur's Iraq had crumbled under the boot of the Western powers, and left in its place was nothing. The US attempted to safeguard what they hoped would become a gem of democracy in the heart of the Middle East over the next 8 years, until everybody was fed up and the US took its ball and went home in 2011. Iraq has been locked in this cycle of vicious dictators and vicious anarchy since its abrupt birth in 1918, the many coups only serving to change the names and beliefs of their malevolent leaders. Saddam, for all the hate he so rightly gets, don't get me wrong, was the devil we had grown to know, and with his deposal we had only been offered a chance to get to know a new one vis-a-vis ISIS. Now excuse me while I take a step onto my soapbox and go a little off script here. Well, I say off script, it's written here, I'm just disclaiming that this is my own opinion. With everything we've discussed in this episode about Iraq, how it became like it was, and what has led it to look like it does now, we face very similar conundrums today, or at least as of my writing. I'm sure you've all heard about the evil dictator al-Assad in Syria, and how the heroic West hand in hand with the noble freedom fighters are going to kick him out and create this new democratic, freedom-loving, really good country, pinky promise, I swear, dude, it'll be totally sick nation. If only. The US serves itself. This goes for them and every other damn country in the world. We're being told this narrative of how they're carving this path to a brave new Middle East, when all they're really doing is bullying every nation that doesn't want to play ball with Uncle Sam. We can hope all these deaths are not in vain and that a time of peace and prosperity is just around the corner for the region, but try hoping into one hand and shitting into the other and see which one fills up first. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Rant over. I apologize. Boy, that was depressing. The thing is with history, it's continuing to be made every day, and we can only hope that one day it'll wrap up into some nice little happy ending. But let's be real, it'll probably be something like Heat Death of the Universe that ends it. I'd like to thank everyone for the massive jump in subscribers, and for anyone that missed my separate announcement, I run a Patreon now, so you can click on it wherever I decide to put it. I'd like to thank all the people that are already pledging to me, and I'd like to personally thank Zedfer, because, well, he pays me the most money, and I like people that do that. I also suppose I should thank my friend Biogoji for helping me out with the research of this episode. He has his own shitty channel he begged me to put in the description, so watch that if you hate yourself. And that's it. Go click on something else now. Preferably one of my things. Leave.